How the scapegoat survivor can recover faith in themselves. Do you have difficult feelings inside that seem impossible to do anything about? Have you felt adversarial towards these feelings because they can be so disruptive? And is it much easier to offer compassion to others than to yourself? Well, the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent has two conflicting goals. First, they must maintain the parent's willingness to care for them. Second, they must cope with the pain of their needs for protection and love going unmet. Survival dictates that the first goal has to take priority. Scapegoat children find themselves being devalued, deprived, and trapped by their narcissistic parent, and they must attach to that parent anyway. To do this, they must find a way to not let their painful feelings get in the way. There's a form of therapy called internal family systems, or IFS, which was developed by a man named Richard Schwartz. And it offers a helpful understanding, I think, for how the scapegoat child accomplishes this conflicting task. In the IFS model, everyone is understood to have multiple parts to themselves. We also have a central self that seeks to coordinate respectful and loving interactions between these parts. Healing consists of understanding how one's parts are currently configured, why they've had to be configured as such, and then patiently, faithfully, and lovingly developing a place for all the parts under the coordination of that central self. In today's video, I explain how the scapegoat child often has to configure their parts to survive the narcissistic abuse they face. The child sends the part of themselves that felt devalued, deprived, and trapped into exile. But with therapy and work within, the scapegoat survivor can cultivate an attitude of faith, patience, and love towards this part. The goal is to increase the sense of belongingness amongst all of one's parts. And I'm going to use a case example to illustrate throughout. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to this process of recovery, and this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers, and where possible and when possible, closeness with safe people. Pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. It's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can validate you, and support you along this path. I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these pillars. Today's video falls under pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. If you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, then I also encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner of the narcissistic abuser. Whether it's self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you have to adopt in order to survive, or understanding as to why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put those closest to them down. This ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems. And you can find the link to the book in the description box below, or by clicking here. The scapegoat child's reality: having to get in where they don't fit in. The scapegoat child to the narcissistic parent finds hostility where kindness is expected. This parent offloads their own feelings of worthlessness onto this child. They then coercively influence the child to identify with these feelings. A hostile attitude towards the child usually does the trick. These maneuvers allow the parent to keep their inflated yet fragile self-esteem intact. When any feelings of worthlessness they experience are the child's fault, the parent in this way gets to feel temporarily spared from it. Children need to share a reality with their parent in order to know that their existence matters and that they are not alone in this world. The scapegoat child is only recognized as an adversary by the very person they need to feel is on their side, their parent. In order to share in this forced upon reality, the child must find their place in it. That is, they must see themselves the way they are being seen by their narcissistic parent. How the scapegoat child uses their parts to fit in. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we all have different parts or recurring states of ourselves that serve different purposes. When we need to feel close to someone, we become gentle and affectionate. When we want to assert ourselves, we often get energized. When we want to play with others, we seek what surprises and delights. All of these different parts map to the different motivational systems that make up our unique personality. When a child is in a good enough family, each of these parts gets to serve a purpose which furthers the child's growth. The child's care about the feelings of others or empathy helps them develop friendships. Maybe the child's natural assertiveness gets channeled towards playing sports. The child's parents in this type of family tend to notice, appreciate, and support these different parts. So the child then can develop a similar inner attitude towards these parts as they develop. The scapegoat child must burden these similar parts with fitting into the narcissistic parent's reality. The child's natural empathy can't be used to further the child's growth. It must be commandeered into being alert to and meeting the emotional needs of their parent. The child's assertive part contradicts that lower status conferred upon them by the narcissistic parent. So this part has to be redirected back at the child. The child's assertive part morphs into maybe an inner critic. Now there's a place for this assertive energy to go, and the child can still share in the parent's reality as someone who has to think of themselves as flawed. I'd like to bring up another case example. So Joe never felt loved by his narcissistic mother. She'd insist on telling him that she loved him all the time and expect him to say it back to her. However, she reacted to any expression of what Joe needed with an eye-rolling exasperation. She showed outright favoritism towards his sister, seemingly demonstrating her ability to love her but not him. And in his mother's rageful attacks on him, she would often offend from the victim position. He had done or not done something so horrendous that she had no choice but to yell at him. Later in his 20s, Joe had difficulty recalling his experience in his child. And as his therapist, I grew to understand that he had to force himself into his mother's reality. He described an inner world that felt chaotic and sometimes incoherent. He said, "At work, I feel like my head always has to be on a swivel. My boss or coworker is going to come along at any moment and tell me that I'm doing something wrong. I'm always trying to guess what it is and make sure I do things right. As a result, I get good performance reviews, but I feel drained and empty at the end of every day. I usually just go home, watch some TV with a drink in my hand, and inevitably fall asleep. But as I'm trying to get to sleep, a really lonely feeling tends to creep in. And I don't know what to do with it, so I just force myself to go to sleep so that I won't have to keep feeling it. Then I get up the next day and do it all over again." Joe was at a loss for how to manage these disparate states. They seemed to take him over depending on his situation. At work, he had to manage others' expectations of him at all times. At home, the only soothing he could find was through the numbing effects of alcohol and television. Before bed, he was visited by a seeming intractable emptiness and aloneness. An IFS map of Joe's inner world. Joe's inner experience corresponded to how he had to adapt to his loveless childhood. He always knew that there was nobody in his family that could offer him comfort. That was not part of the reality he was afforded to share with his narcissistic parent. He felt abandoned and worthless, but these feelings became a liability. Expressing the pain he felt to those who were inflicting it upon him did not help. Joe had to burden the part of him that felt his feelings with staying silent. Then he had to exile this part into his unconscious. I'll call this part the hurt truth teller. With the hurt truth teller, in essence, in exile, the solver part gained much more influence. This part knew the dire situation Joe faced. With endless energy, this part was always looking around for signs of trouble. Trouble could mean the slightest indication of dissatisfaction by his narcissistic parent. When detected, he would then spring into action to smooth out the situation. This solver part helped Joe share in his parents' reality too. This part did not question what Joe was responsible for or not. When the solver was told of or accused of being a problem, he went to work. There was a third part that afforded Joe some momentary relief from the rigors of his life. This part that I called the soother would find ways to escape by numbing his senses. When he was younger, the soother would emerge as Joe lost himself in video games alone in his room. Today, the soother used television and alcohol to give him an oasis of rest from all this inner tumult. When the soother was in charge, the hurt truth teller seemed light years away, and the solver could be deactivated because Joe was too numb to worry about the signs of trouble. Distinguishing the parts from their burdens. One of the essential processes in healing from an IFS perspective is making compassionate contact with one's parts. An important principle in this compassion is that the parts are not their burdens. Joe's parts had been burdened with holding pain for which there was no solution, solving problems that were not his own, and dosing himself with enough relief that he could keep going. If he had a good enough parent, then that hurt truth teller could have just been the truth teller. The solver could have been used to solve problems that he found interesting, and the soother could have sought relaxation in connected relationships. Back to Joe's case, at the start of therapy, he tended to regard his solver part as undignified and his soother as evidence of his laziness. I would counter Joe's attitude with curiosity about each part's experience. Then I would try to ask him how each part might be trying to help or protect him. Well, over the course of several years in treatment, Joe's attitude towards his parts began to shift and did shift. His experience of the non-judgmental, curious, and compassionate attitude towards him and his parts in the therapy seemed to be getting internalized. As this happened, something else emerged: hope. He said, "I've never seen the point of staying in consistent contact with myself. Life only used to feel livable when I was not paying attention to my inner experience. Now, when I feel the pain of the truth teller, I don't see it as endless. I know that this part deserves patience and to be listened to. And I have faith that if I do, then this part's pain can be helped. I never used to have hope for my parts before." Joe described an important shift that can happen in therapy for scapegoat survivors. In order for the scapegoat child to fit into the parent's reality, they have to exile the parts of themselves that do not fit. The child cannot keep in consistent contact with themselves. They find it hopeless to do so when they have to be dependent on the narcissistic parent. Therapy offered a relationship that did not require Joe to exile parts of himself in order to share a reality with his therapist. And this, I believe, allowed him to exercise patience and find hope towards his parts. Now Joe found himself more curious than dismissive towards his hurt truth teller part. Although that part felt immense despair at having to be in exile for so long, Joe still wanted to hear from him. Joe also developed a hope and a faith that the hurt truth teller part may not always feel this way, that with enough ongoing connection, the part's hurt might begin to heal. And this faith made Joe stay oriented towards his inner world as the path towards purpose rather than finding relief by having to escape himself. Well, I hope today's sort of map from an internal family perspective into the inner world sometimes of a scapegoat survivor may be useful to you in your own process. I want to thank everyone again for your continued support, engagement, and comments on the videos. Again, the community that seems to have been created and has been built and sustained through this channel is really incredibly heartening to read. And I think there's so much wisdom and bravery in the comments. I'm very often blown away by the perceptiveness and wisdom of the comments that are in below the videos. So with that, again, thank you, and I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.